So today we are going to move on to the next step of our handmade sketchbook tutorial. By this point you should have the binding all complete with your thread, sewing our individual signatures together, and then you'll also need a couple other materials for this next step. One of the supplies that you'll need today is a little bit of Mod Podge, and it doesn't matter if you've purchased gloss or matte, either one will work for what we're going to do. Mod Podge is a really great inexpensive thing that you can get that serves a lot of different purposes for art making. It is a water-based sealer, and it's sort of a really nice clear top coat protectant, and that means you can coat the top of a painting like acrylic painting, and it will produce a perfectly crystal clear, shiny, or matte top coat depending on if you bought gloss or matte. And it also acts as a glue, which is what we're going to use it for today, to add a nice gummed hinge that's flexible along the edge of our spine. So with the Mod Podge, you'll need a couple of other things. You can use something just laying around your house to pour a little bit of your Mod Podge out on. I'm just using a piece of tin foil, and it could be a paper plate or like the lid from a throwaway Tupperware container, something like that works great. I've got a little piece of paper towel and a very inexpensive paintbrush. So this is just one from a set that was like $3. I never like to use nice paintbrushes with Mod Podge or gel medium or glue. Anything that's a type of adhesive, I always use something very inexpensive. In case I accidentally ruin the brush, I haven't ruined something that cost a lot of money. An optional supply that you can have for today is if you have binder clips, 2 binder clips that are wide enough to clip on the edge, the thickness of your book, just right there near that top spine. Now, if you do not have these, that is totally fine. You do not have to have them for this next part. I just like it if you've got it, because it can just help stabilize and sort of compress those pages. But if you don't have binder clips, you do not have to use them. The other thing that you will need are heavy books and just some scrap throwaway paper. I've just torn up some old pages that I have, just some newsprint. It could be newspaper, it could be ripped out magazine pages, it could be some junk mail, whatever you've got laying around the house. And then just 2 heavy books that we're gonna use to compress our pages together and let this glue set up and dry. You will also need just a little jar or a little glass of water to rinse your brush out in. Use something that is a throwaway container or a container like this glass jar that you can use for the future whenever you're painting, but make sure that it's something that you are never planning on eating or drinking out of again. So like a yogurt cup, a disposable yogurt cup, something like that works great. This is a jar that I've been using for the last decade. It is my dedicated painting jar. You can get just a little scrap piece of paper to sort of work on, just so you don't mess up your work table area. And then with your book, and I'm just gonna sort of prop this book up and try to make it stand on end, just so I can work with it. And then I'm gonna take my Mod Podge and my water cup. Now I'm gonna start with my brush wet from my water cup, just because that helps prevent the glue from getting into all of the pores of the bristles of the brush. So I'm just gonna wet that brush and then dab it off just a little bit. I don't want it soaking wet. And I'm gonna grab a little bit of that Mod Podge, and I'm really just gonna glob it on, making a nice thick coat, and start spreading it out. Now, the little strands of thread that you have, I like to lay those down and get those to where they're glued along that spine. And I sort of squeeze and compress those pages together as I'm gluing. I try not to get the Mod Podge along the front or the back page, if I can help it. Normally, if we were doing this in the classroom, we would be using a little bit of a thicker bodied material called gel medium. But since we're doing this at home, Mod Podge is a good alternative. So anytime you have those threads, I just lay those down into the Mod Podge and spread it out. So I've got a nice coat. I've got everything sort of sealed down. You can take your brush and rinse it out really good in your water. I try never to let my brushes just sit and soak in my water because that's actually not good for the handle of the brush and the metal part right here called the ferrule. It'll eventually end up swelling the wood and loosening the attachment point here on the ferrule. So always rinse your brush out good and dab it off on your paper towel, and I'm gonna go wash that as soon as I'm done. So now that I've got that finished, if you have any extra Mod Podge that's gotten on the seam, I just wipe that off with my finger and just sort of wipe that on a paper towel or on your extra paper. I don't want this to be on those edges. So now that I've got that done, I'm gonna grab my 2 books. And because I don't want to ruin my books and get Mod Podge on them, I'm going to protect them. So I'm gonna put a layer of scrap paper. I'm gonna lay my pages there, put another layer of scrap paper, and put a nice really heavy book right there on top. And now I'm gonna let that dry for about 15-20 minutes, and then I'm gonna come back and do a second coat. While I'm letting that Mod Podge dry, I'm gonna run to the sink and wash my paintbrush, because if that Mod Podge dries in the bristles of this brush, then you will end up with a totally stiff, ruined brush, because this Mod Podge really is just a glue. So what you wanna do when you wash your brushes, if you have a bar soap like Ivory soap or Dove soap or something like that, that's totally fine. You can also just use hand soap that you have at your sink. You could use Dawn dish detergent, whatever you've got that's convenient. But rinse your brush really good underneath the water, and I always take my fingernail, and scrape down on the brush as I'm running it underneath the water. That's gonna make sure that those bristles, I'm sort of working any of that Mod Podge or paint or whatever I happen to be using, I'm pulling it down from the top of the bristles down into the bottom to rinse it out. And I'll rotate the brush as I do that. I'll also take the bristles and swirl them in the palm of my hand, but keeping those bristles together. You never want to splay your bristles out where they're going in all sorts of different directions, because that is a quick way to ruin your paintbrush. And then once I've rinsed it good, doing those 2 things, I'll add a little bit of soap, and I will go back and swirl and scrape and swirl and scrape, and then give everything a good rinse. And I'll repeat that 2 or 3 times with more soap and swirling and scraping until I feel like I've gotten that brush really clean. I'll give it a good rinse, and then once it's finished, I straighten back out all of the bristles, and then I let it lay flat to dry. That is the best way to take care of your brush so that way it lasts a long time. Now that my book has had a few minutes to dry, I'm gonna do another coat. We're also gonna be adding a ribbon bookmark on this next layer. You should have a pre-cut piece, but I'm gonna show you how to measure it out in case you ever want to do this on your own. What I like to do is measure along the spine. So starting right there, just above that section, I lay the ribbon down along the whole spine, and that's gonna be the part that gets glued to our spine. And having that nice length of ribbon is gonna ensure that it won't ever come undone or come unglued. And then I'm gonna also add the length of ribbon that will be the part that we see and use. I'm gonna bring that down the length of the book. And then I like to add an extra inch or 2 depending on how long you want that ribbon to be. And then I'm gonna take my scissors and snip that at a nice angle. Now that I have my ribbon cut, I am going to stand my book pages back up on end. So I'm gonna come back with a little bit more Mod Podge, and I'm gonna start in by adding a second coat. Now, if you have gotten any along the front or back edge, you can just wipe those off and clean it up a little bit. And while this is wet, I'm gonna take my ribbon and lay it down into that wet Mod Podge. So again, starting right above that first set of knots, and just lightly I'm gonna tap it down into that wet glue, trying to get it to adhere. And then I'm gonna put another coat right on top of that to help seal all of that in together. Of course, rinse your brush really good, and you can go wash it as soon as you are done. Check the sides, make sure there's no Mod Podge left on those. And then I'm going to set this back up inside my books a second time to let it dry. So again, I've got now my extra ribbon at the top. I'm going to lay that down, set my book, more scrap paper, and another book, and let that compress and dry. Now that I've given that some more time to fully dry, I can take off the clips, if you have those binder clips. And the last step that we're gonna do to get our book pages ready to go into our cover, I'm gonna slide that bookmark just there on the inside. What we need to do is create what I like to call the wings of our pages. And that sounds really strange, but these wings are what's gonna actually hold the papers into the cover of our book. So I've asked you to purchase a fat quarter of fabric, and you are just gonna open that up. We're gonna need a section of fabric that will fit lengthwise in between this side of the stitches starting and this side of the stitches starting. So on my measurements, that is a little less than 7 inches long. And then the width doesn't really matter, but I say I want to have at least 1 inch on either side. So maybe about 3 inches wide. So I'm gonna say 6.5 by about 3. And those are really just rough guesstimates. Those do not have to be very precise, but just starting in the corner of my fabric, and my fabric actually has a really rough, ugly end. I think I will use that part just because this will never be seen. This is gonna be on the inside of the book. So I don't wanna waste good fabric that I'll need for my cover. You can take a pencil, gonna say about 3 inches wide, about 6.5. And I'm just working with this long ways on this whole fabric because I'm gonna use this fabric to make the cover of my book. I'm gonna take it out of a corner, that way I've got plenty of room and plenty of fabric left to make the outside cover. And then the rest of this I'm gonna put away. And now I just need that little small section. And again, the edges don't have to be too clean or too precise. This is going on the inside of the book. Nobody's ever gonna see it. So you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so for this last step, I'm gonna go back in with my Mod Podge, and the length of this rectangle, we're gonna position it where it's centered on the book, It's centered this way and it's centered this way. And then I've got an even amount of extra fabric on the left and right side of the spine. That's where we're gonna put it. So kind of visualizing that space, I'm gonna lay in a coat of Mod Podge. And then take my fabric and center everything up and lay it in that wet Mod Podge. And then I'm gonna take my fingers and squish it into there. And I should feel that moisture from the glue seeping through the pores of that fabric. That is what we want. We're gonna basically saturate the fabric right along that spine, completely with glue underneath it, coming up through the fabric pores, and a coat on top. So now with more Mod Podge, I'm gonna come right through this top edge. Now I do want to make sure I don't get Mod Podge along the sides. And if you want to make sure that this Mod Podge is really worked into the fabric, you can rub that with one of your fingers. And just double check that everything is nicely coated. This part is really important because this is what is holding your whole book together and holding all of those pages inside. So we want to make sure that it's all very well secured. Again, rinse your brush really good and go immediately wash it as soon as you're done. Now I should have, and this is why I call it the wings, I should have wings on both sides with the extra fabric. These wings will be glued into the cover of our book once we have those made. I want to make sure that the fabric isn't accidentally glued down to the back or the front of the book. So I like to just really gently make sure that it's only touching on the spine. And if it's glued down anywhere, just really gently lift that part back up. And then you can rest this back underneath your books